And today I have the privilege of introducing Dr. J.D. Payne. He is a professor in the Christian Ministry program in the School of the Arts at Samford. Prior to joining Samford, Dr. Payne served as an associate professor of church planting and evangelism at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's also taught as an adjunct professor at Crossroads Bible College in Indianapolis, Boyce College in Louisville, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, Wake Forest, and Beeson Divinity School here, where at my request, he teaches strategies and current issues and missions, and he's also taught evangelism and church planting here at Beeson as well. Dr. Payne has experience as a pastor, church planter, and is a highly involved leader in several missiological societies. His blog is jdpayne.org, and his podcast is entitled Strike the Match. Give those a try. Strike the Match, like the podcast title. His books in alphabetical order are... No, I'm not actually going to read that. But I will tell you that for today, I've asked him to share about one of his latest books that will be published next year. And it's entitled Apostolic Imagination, Recovering a Biblical Vision for the Church's Mission Today. So should I start with your podcast intro? He starts his podcast like this. So let's... I know I'm not actually going to do that, but he does actually strike that match. Do it. He's not here.
I love Dr. David Parks. I have known him for many years. He's a great friend, great scholar. I have been so, and I'm telling the truth now. This is not a preacher story. Some of you will get that later. Thank you for that amen back there. I heard that laugh. I'm so impressed with Dr. Parks' leadership and what he has been doing, Lord's been doing in and through him, through Beeson. All the things on this campus have been so encouraging. And 3 years ago, when I had the privilege of coming to Samford as a professor, really having the opportunity to connect with his brother on another level, and I've been encouraging my students to take advantage of things here at Beeson Divinity School. You Beeson students are really, really blessed with the faculty and leadership that's here at this time. This is an amazing, amazing time, and so just so thankful for everything that's going on. But I do have to say that I know that even though all the great things that Dr. David has done, he's scraping the bottom of the barrel when he invites me to come in and speak at Global Voices, and so. So he's digging at the bottom of the barrel, but hopefully you will not hold what is about to happen against him in days to come. But no, thank you, brother, so much thank you so much, brother, for the invitation. I greatly appreciate that. So let me jump in and get started today by saying a few things before kind of the prologue to where I'm going. I recognize that what I'm about to talk about is something that is. For some of you, it's going to be fresh. It's going to be something that you may have not heard before. Some of you, it's going to be, yeah, my church has been talking about this for some time. Yeah, my denomination has been wrestling through these issues for a while now. I'm hoping that you will take something away that will get the wheels turning, because basically what I'm going to be pushing in on today are some very complex and very complicated issues that did not just begin last year. They've been going on for centuries. I'm not advocating that I've got it all figured out. I am basically saying here's some things that I think we need to keep in mind when it comes to the Great Commission work that the church is engaged in on a global scale, but especially for those of us in the traditionally Western context. And so some of the things, the questions that may come to your mind, I may shrug and may not have an answer, but may say, hey, we've got to lock arms on this journey together and try to figure this out. I'm going to do something else here. I'm going to give you all the contact information I can that I think would be most helpful to you for a few reasons. One, I want to make this PowerPoint slide presentation available to you if you want it. Shoot me an email. I'll be glad to send it to you for $19.95. No, I'm sorry. I'll be glad to let you have it. You just let me know, because there's going to be a lot of information that I'll be sharing with you. I'm even going to do some book reading today. You know, I know people go to places and they like to hear their novelist, favorite author to read from his or her book and do a book reading. No one ever does that with nonfiction books. It's like, But I'm going to do a reading for you today. I'm going to do some reading. But you're going to have questions that will come up. I'm going to try to allow for some time for us to be able to have some questions. I'm not going to be able to cover everything that's in this book, but I want to make this slide presentation available to you. I also give all my information up here to say, hey, if you want to carry on the conversation. So some of you like to reach out through social media, connect with me there. Some of you prefer email. That's fine. Also, Dr. Parks mentioned my podcast. I've done several episodes last season, season 6, on Apostolic Imagination, breaking down various components of things that I'll be sharing with you today. And so those podcasts are available for you there. I've written extensively on this on my blog over the past several years. At the same time, Lord willing, next week on my YouTube channel, I'm going to be doing a series of videos that will be on this topic as well. So he mentioned the book. So I'm really excited about this. So Lord willing, February of next year, around Valentine's Day, Apostolic Imagination will hopefully be released with Baker Academic. I know some of you that had me for the evangelism class last semester, you got to read a draft of that. Who was in that class? Anybody here? Oh, so a few of you. Yeah, I saw the dirty looks when they saw me come in. No, but yeah, they got a chance to see a rough draft of that. So around February of next year, around Valentine's Day. So if you're looking for a great gift for your significant other, let me tell you what, nothing says loving like a book from J.D. Payne on Valentine's Day. So I'm telling you, right there. Let me quickly share with you the contents of this book. So I basically break this book up into two major components: foundations, and then what I call reimagining contemporary missions. And so let me just quickly go through the overview of the table of contents, and that'll move us into where we're going to go today. So I talk about what is an apostolic imagination, and those are some things I'll bring up today as well. Challenges to the imagination. Well, a few of those things will come up in our conversation today. What is the apostolic identity in the New Testament, and what is apostolic function in the New Testament? So I spend a couple of chapters digging into the exegetical issues related to apostolos in the first century, and look at exactly who was identified as an apostle, what were the characteristics of apostles, what were the functions of apostles, and so on and so forth. All of that's sort of foundational material. And then today I'm going to get into several of these on the right side, so the reimagining aspects, and that is what I think we need to begin to do is really begin to look at the language that we use when we speak of mission today. And so reimagining language, our identity. What is this thing called a missionary? What is missions? Reimagining priority, reimagining function, reimagining location, strategy, and even reimagining the West. So if the church is growing the fastest and is the largest outside of the Western world, how should the Western church relate and engage in partnerships, particularly in a post-colonialism, post-colonized time in world history? And so a lot of what I'm pushing forward in this book is it's different in the sense that I'm asking the church to really look at our predominant paradigm by the way in which we filter and process and even act in the world around us, whether that's across the street or across the world. But I want to begin by getting you thinking about this passage, because I want you to understand who's talking to you. I'm not a missionary. I've never considered myself a missionary. My calling has always been a pastor-teacher. So in Ephesians 4:11 and 12, he gave some pastor-teachers to equip the saints. So when you hear me share some of these things, I am speaking and I'm writing from the perspective of a pastor-teacher and not from the perspective of someone who is a mission agency leader or from a missionary. Now that's going to be really important, because some of the things that you may hear me say or some of the things that you may read, you may begin to say, well, wait a minute, JD is against pastors. And I would say I'm absolutely not against that. And some of the things you may hear me say and some of the things you may read, you may say, well, he's actually trying to talk about getting less missionaries to the field. And I would say, no, I'm absolutely not doing that at all, but that pastoral leaders should be more involved in shepherding people to the field. Let me tell you a little story here. Some of you remember this device, right? Before cell phones came out, smartphones, we used to buy these little systems to put on our car. I'll tell you why I first got my Garmin. It's because I left Birmingham one night, about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I was driving back home to Louisville, Kentucky when I was a professor at Southern Seminary. And as I was driving home around Nashville, my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about a variety of things. And there was construction work going on the road in downtown Nashville. I had driven the route from Nashville to Louisville on Interstate 65 numerous times, probably 30 or 40 times. That 3-hour route, I felt like I knew it like the back of my hand. This particular night, my mind is elsewhere. I do not have a GPS. I do not have a smartphone at the time. And somewhere along the journey, I get off of Interstate 65 out of Birmingham, and I start heading west. And I'm embarrassed to tell you this story, But as I was driving down the road, I began to realize, wow, there's some billboards I've never seen before. Where did that state park come from? I've never crossed this bridge before. Who built this river here? 2 hours out of Nashville going west. It hits me when it's dark. I don't know where I am. And I thought I was going in the right direction, and I was going in the wrong direction. Doing the right things, but I was going in the wrong direction. So I want us to begin to think about this issue of what is the church called to do in light of the world in which we live. And I would say that shift has not occurred in 2,000 years. Now, the way that it manifests itself, the contextualization issues, that's a different story. But what are we called to do? What is that apostolic task? What's that role that we're to engage in? And I would say that it requires us to function with what I call an apostolic imagination. I think when we look at the Scriptures, you see this. In Acts chapter 1, verse 6, Jesus is about to ascend back into heaven. The apostles still have not gotten it right. The disciples that are standing there with him, they still have not grasped exactly what's going on. They're thinking that, okay, the Messiah's here, we can touch you, we can feel you, we can smell you, we can hear you. Old Testament prophets said that this day would come. Day of the Lord is here. Restoration of all things is here. Hey, Jesus, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom? And what does he say? He says, it's not for you to know the times and the days of when all that's going to take place, but you will be my witnesses when the Holy Spirit comes upon you in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the world. They were having to transition their way of thinking, their imagination, into what was about to take place. That the eschatological ingathering of the Gentiles was about to come in sweeping waves, but it wasn't going to happen the way that they thought it was going to happen. And so there was this notion of them returning to the Scriptures and saying, what is the Lord doing here? What's happening in our present time? And we'd see this throughout the book of Acts. We'd see it when they begin to question, well, do the Samaritans and do the Gentiles, do the God-fearers, do all these people have the same Holy Spirit that we Jews do? And the whole council that takes place in Acts chapter 15. So I'm going to give you a little reading here as I begin to talk about what is the apostolic imagination to kind of get us thinking. Yet with all the discussions, publications, and missions taking place, a great deal of confusion remains. The language of mission is unclear. Is missions passing out gospel tracts in China or overseeing food distribution in Nicaragua? Is missions church planting in Iraq or constructing a building for a church in Russia? Or does missions include all of these examples and others as well? Identity is unclear. Is every Christian a missionary or only those who relocate their lives to a remote location overseas? Are doctors and teachers missionaries, even if they do not share the gospel? Or are evangelists the only missionaries? The purpose and priority of missions is unclear. Do missionaries go to help serve people with great physical needs? If so, what is the difference between them and any NGO? Do missionaries go and share the gospel and do nothing related to social justice and physical needs? Is evangelism the priority for social needs? Or is there no overarching mission priority at all, but rather multiple equivalent actions? Practices are unclear. What are missionaries to do on the field? Are they to be involved in church planting activities? Are they to be involved in relief and development? Are they to be involved in training leaders, caring for the environment, freeing those captives to human traffickers, alleviating poverty? How should funding and sending structures be established? Should the church spend most of her money at home or abroad? Should people be sent to reached or unreached areas of the world? Or are all locations equal? How should pastors be involved in sending church members to the nations? People are making inquiries about the church in the West. Is the West a mission field? If so, it is unlike anything that has been traditionally labeled a mission field. If the West is a mission field, then how should the church, which operates from a pastoral hegemony, function in contexts that demand apostolic work and not pastoral work? What about the role of the church in the West in a post-colonial age? If the church is larger and growing at a faster rate in the majority world, then how should Western churches consider the future of their kingdom labors? What does biblical partnership look like in the 21st century? My reason for writing the book. My reason for writing this book is that the church, I believe, has lost her way. She, somewhere around Nashville, got distracted and is now heading out in another direction. The church has lost her way in the disciple-making task. She's ventured away from the path of the apostolic and continues down a road involving numerous important and good activities labeled as missions. The need of the hour is to ask, what is the apostolic imagination that influenced much of the first century labors, and how does it affect the church's global task today? So when we begin to think about this issue of what is this apostolic imagination, here's the way I understand it. Here's the way that I unpack this concept. During the first century, the apostolic imagination was a spirit-transformed mindset that helped facilitate urgent and widespread gospel proclamation, disciple-making, what we would call church planting, and leadership development. It established a mental framework related to strategy. Jesus, are you now at this time going to restore the kingdom? You will be my witnesses after the Holy Spirit comes upon you. The apostolic imagination is connected to history, so not divorced of history, connected to history and the present. It demands a returning to the text, the biblical text, and asking questions related to both belief and practice. It calls the church in the present to be a wise steward with her time and resources in light of God's mission. The apostolic imagination does not neglect church life after the first century, but challenges the church in every age to evaluate her predecessors and practices. There's much to learn, but not everything learned is worth applying to the present. What I see is that we've shifted on our foundation in the sense that we have allowed a lot of this to be assumed when it comes to our practices on the field, and we're allowing a great deal of tradition and culture, personal preference, and contemporary realities to shape our understanding of this Great Commission work that we're doing. And in that journey, our understanding of Scripture and theology has often been proof texts. Proof texting why we're doing what we're doing on the field. Proof texting what our strategies involve and what is taking place. And I would say a great deal in the book, we've got to begin to re-establish that understanding of what do we believe about this concept that we have come to call missions or this Great Commission task. So in the second half of the book, as you saw on the table of contents, I talk a lot about reimagining these different concepts. I want to start by talking about reimagining language. When you are spending time with missionaries today, and I spend a great deal of time with missionaries and mission leaders and missiologists, you put us in a room and you begin to talk about missions or you talk about missionaries, and pretty soon you realize, wait a minute, we're not all on the same page. In fact, we're operating with different dictionaries in hand. You put us in a room, see where we stand on Orthodox theology, and we all check the right boxes. But then when you begin to talk about this issue, it's like, well, what dictionary are you using? It's kind of like witnessing to Mormons. It's like we're all using the same words, and we got different definitions of what we're using. And so consider this. Consider even the most traditional and conservative evangelical pastors will announce on Sunday the youth choir's mission trip will take place next year as they go to Appalachia to sing in the worship services of another church, and the men on mission will be doing missions in Honduras this summer by installing a roof on a school. But today they are to pray for the missionaries planting churches in the Middle East among an unreached people group. What are we talking about here? Michael Stroop, in a fantastic book, though I don't agree with all of his conclusions, takes a historical look at the language of mission as a modern construct. And he makes a statement. He says, mission language forms particular ideas and notions that shape identity and purpose that determines why and how we act. What he's saying is that the terms that we use influence the way we come to understand ourselves and the world around us, and then how we act in the world, particularly related to this concept of the Great Commission. So the question that I want us to also think about today is, where did we get those words? Mission, missionaries, missions. So as a modern construct, where does it primarily come from? We have to go back to the 16th century. And what we see, what we see is Ignatius begins developing these words, using these words to apply to the Jesuits. Prior to that time, the notion of missions, it was brought up in theological terminology, but a great deal of it had to do with the interworkings of the Trinity. But what you see in the 16th century is a shift, a bringing of that language out of the Latin into the use of this Great Commission work. Now, what is fascinating is that at that same time in history, what is happening in Western European countries? And that is, you're seeing the rise and the development of European expansion and colonialization beginning to slowly pick up. And so the old adage of merchants, military, and missionaries traveling together to various locations across the globe, often on the same boats, was very much a part of that reality. And they would arrive on the same shores to connect with the same people doing completely different things. And so it's out of that this modern use of these terms begin to develop and begin to shape the way that we see this concept of missions. Now, what happens is that you fast forward, and the historians in the room, Dean's here, I'm in trouble. The historians in the room will not like me saying this because I'm compressing so much history in a short period of time. So I'm standing back here, I'm going to duck when they start throwing things at me. But what happens is, after that period of time, when we get into the 17th and 18th century and we begin to see the pietist movement come up onto the scene and really explode, what happens is a great deal of zeal for personal piety, personal holiness, and taking the gospel to the nations across the street and across the world begins to really kick in. There was a huge amount of zeal that began to move forward, and it was out of that movement that the influence begins to ripple out, and we begin to see the great century of missions. We begin to see what takes place from William Carey in the end of the 18th century all the way up until about 1910 with the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference. The nations begin to hear the gospel through Protestant work. And what does the Holy Spirit do? The Spirit does exactly what the Spirit promised He would do. People came to faith, churches were planted, leaders began to grow and develop. But what had been happening up until that point in time was primarily a zeal and a drive. We read a text of Scripture, Jesus says, go preach the gospel to all nations, go make disciples, and that's right, I'm going to do that. He's my Lord, I'm going to follow Him. But there's not a great deal of theological undergirding. There's not a great deal of the foundation on that pyramid structure that's there. And so we've been hearing this for centuries, going back to Ignatius and the Jesuits. We talk about missions and missionaries. Those are the people that go. Jesus has said this, I'm going to go. And there's a lot of proof texting and going, a lot of zeal. But what happens in the 20th century is something that has been referred to as a Copernicum Revolution. And that is theologians, and they were not often very conservative theologians at that time, began to take notice of what had been happening throughout the majority world. That all this time, the church was taking root and growing and developing and multiplying, and attentions were turned in many directions, but now it's like, let's look across the world. This is not just a Western Protestant thing anymore. Maybe we need to see what theologians have to say about this. And so you begin to move into this time whereby theologians begin to take the traditional language, the people that I will call the traditionalists, with all the zeal and the drive and sacrificed a great deal over the centuries. They begin to take the same language and they begin to say, well, let's go back to the Scriptures. Let's see, what is this thing called the mission of God? What was God doing, Genesis to Revelation, to go about bringing about the restoration of all things and bringing about creation, seeing redemption occur and a groaning creation healed? What's God been doing? And what they walk away with is the notion that God has this mission, and it's not the church's mission. It starts with God. And all that God does to build His kingdom is the mission of God, the Missio Dei. The church has a mission, but that mission comes from God, and it's what the church does in the world for God is what the church should be engaged in. And because the Missio Dei is so massive and broad, and God's into all these things, not just the salvation of individuals, but doing all these things to bring about the restoration of a broken cosmos, therefore, what the church should be engaging in and doing should be very broad as well. And so what you begin to see is this concept called missions, with an S, is the specific work of the church and her agencies. Now the traditionalists come along and they basically say, whoa, wait a minute. Missions has always been about evangelism, church planting, and developing leaders. That's what it's about. It's narrow, it's tight, it's tightly defined. And the revisionists are saying, no. Just look at the Bible. Genesis through Revelation. It's broad and wide. God's broad and wide in what He's doing, and the church is to be involved in a variety of activities. Let's look at the Scriptures. Look at all the things that the church is involved in. And so where we find ourselves in the midst of the middle of the 20th century, when people begin to really get serious about writing theologies of mission, is this. And it's still with us today. The traditionalists are saying, these words are mine, and the definitions are mine. And the revisionists say, no, these words are mine, and the definitions are mine. And the question that I ask is, where'd you get those words? Because anytime you do not begin to develop significant concepts that influence what you do out of an exegetical theology, and you begin to create words borrowing from extra-biblical language and then trying to go to the Scriptures to find support from that, then who's to say someone can't come along in another generation and begin to say, well, this is what these words mean to me. In other words, the concepts are there in the Scriptures, but the terminology over time coming from other sources begins to get muddled and mixed together, and we get ourselves in a situation like this. So though the work of the revisionists revealed the shortcomings of the traditionalist view, they also made two significant mistakes. So I think the traditionalists were too narrow in what they're saying about what we see in the Scriptures about God's activity and what the church is to be involved in. But at the same time, I think the revisionists made two significant mistakes. The apostolic work of the church became one equivalent function among many, and the urgency to communicate the gospel was lost or diminished. So when everything becomes just a bunch of things that the church is to engage in because it's supposed to be broad, because God is broad in what He's doing in the world, in the universe, then the notion of the apostolic work of the church just becomes one more piece of all the different pieces of what the church is supposed to be engaging in. Just because God's activity is broad does not lead to the conclusion that the church's multiple actions are equivalent. It is true the church was involved in many activities throughout the New Testament, but the apostolic functions received special attention, a matter often overlooked by revisionists. When everything became equal, the urgency of evangelism and disciple-making faded. If God was just as concerned about restoring a polluted environment as He was with saving an unbeliever, then why prioritize? And you will find, an excellent book on Theology of Mission, though I disagree with him on a few points. That's probably one of the most popular works today is Chris Wright's work, Mission of God. It's outstanding work. But, Wright will say, creation care. Well, if you're doing creation care, you're engaging in mission. And then you turn a few pages later, he will say, everything's equal when it comes to engaging in mission in the world. There are no priorities. And so we have reached a point in church history whereby the church can engage in mission or missions without ever sharing the gospel. And so I would say, well, what's a possible way to move forward? And I would say one way to consider moving forward at this point, just one, there are others out there, and that is instead of asking what is mission, or missionaries, the church should be asking, is there a biblical terminology and emphasis when it comes to the church's identity and ongoing actions in the world? And what did those actions look like in the first century? And are there things that we can translate into where we are today? So that's thinking about language. How about identity? And I would say, I think we need to reimagine our identity. So what about this? If a teacher moves to the Middle East to teach in a Christian school, does that make him a missionary? If a certified public accountant takes a job in Asia and serves with the church planting team, is she a missionary? CPA or both? What does she tell others when she's asked, what do you do? Is it correct to refer to the short-term team of adults sent from their churches as missionaries? Or what about the person in his country of birth who is serving with an unreached people group? So here's the question. Are all Christians missionaries? So you throw this into a room sometime, depending on who you got in there, and again, the responses are wild and crazy sometimes. So it depends on whether or not you're more in the revisionist camp or more in the traditionalist camp. So if you hold to a revisionist perspective and you believe that everything is mission, everything the church does is equivalent, and this notion of Great Commission activity, evangelism, disciple-making, things of that nature, it's just as equivalent with the other activities and tasks that the church is supposed to be involved in, then you're going to say, yeah. In all likelihood, you'll probably say, yeah, that everyone is a missionary. If you hold to a traditionalist perspective and you basically say, no, mission is restricted to evangelism, church planting, then you're going to say, well, no, not all Christians are missionaries. If you think that mission is about crossing cultural gaps or going overseas, we're going overseas to do missions, then you're probably going to say no. Or maybe you find yourself in either one of these perspectives, and regardless of perspective, some will say that a missionary is only those that are formally commissioned or sent by a church or agency. In other words, this is where we find ourselves today when we're asking the question about, well, who is a missionary? So where are we? What is a possible way forward in this direction? And I would begin to say, I think we need to return to an apostolic identity. And we need to really begin to go back and look and say, well, all right, then what was that understanding of an apostolic identity in the New Testament? And I'll warn you that when you do that study, you will find out that the answer to that question will not fit nice and neatly on a business card. The Apostle Paul, Barnabas, here's my identity. But I would say we need to begin to really think about some of these things. Well, what about priority? How about reimagining the issue of priority? Right now, among conservative evangelicals, at least in the States, in a North American, I'll say a North American context, the notion of are there any priorities when it comes to this thing that we're talking about today, the majority perspective is no. If you hold to a view that says, oh no, there are priorities, when it comes to this Great Commission task, when it comes to what the church is to be engaged in the world today, if you hold to the viewpoint that there are priorities, that there is a prioritization, then you hold to a minority viewpoint, a minority perspective. I don't know what the percentages are on that, but it's a reality that's out there. God's mission in the world is broad and multifaceted. That's important for us to keep in mind. But both the Trinity and the New Testament church reveal an apostolic priority related to God's goal of redemption and restoration of all things. Though the church's actions in the world are also numerous, and that's a good thing, they are not equivalent with one another. Life in the kingdom through local expressions of the church is to be represented by gospel proclamation and social transformation. Believers are to be salt and light, both in word and action. Confusion has often resulted when the church has overlooked the apostolic role and concentrated on the established church role. Now, hang on to that thought for a second, because I'm going to move to that one very quickly. I would say what we have often done is we've basically not seen a distinction between established church ministries and living out the kingdom ethic and the sending of the disciple-making teams, the apostolic teams, the church planting teams, and what that looks like for them to live out the kingdom ethic. So we come to a crossroads, and I would begin to argue that a Great Commission triage is necessary and needed. That not everything is equal. And I think we see that throughout Scripture, and I unpack this in various places throughout the Scriptures, but just to kind of leave you with one, Acts chapter 6, for example, in the first 6 verses. So you have the food distribution issue, significant issue, majorly important matter in the life of the Jerusalem church, the Hebraic widows and the Grecian widows having this discrepancy. The apostles are brought into the task. They're working on it. And the apostles are not sitting back saying, this is useless, this is not important, this is a waste of time, this is insignificant. They said, this is really, really important. So much so, you all call 7 people together to oversee this. Because what's happening is the neglect of the preaching of the word and prayer. And what do they do? The issue's resolved. But here's the fascinating thing, because some have said, Chris Wright, and again, I love Chris Wright's stuff. I've been highly influenced by his work, so please don't hear me dissing on him at all. He sees that text and he says, well, it was a priority for the apostles, but for the 7 that attended the tables, that was the priority for them. Everything's equal. I would say that's not where the gravity of the text lies, because if you look at where Luke's emphasis is on the text, the results of what takes place is not how much harmony now takes place between the Greek and the Hebrew widows. Luke's attention is on the expansion of the gospel, so much so that when this issue is resolved, some of the hardest people of the gospel are now coming to faith, the priests. And so I would say that along with other passages, we see that there is something in the first century that we would use modern language and say it was some kind of triage kind of set up. So reimagining function. So think about this. Much of the confusion regarding mission function is due to, I believe, misplaced expectations. An apostolic team and a local church are not the same. One gives birth to local churches, the other commissions and sends teams. One establishes communities to live out the kingdom ethic. The other lives out the ethic in ways unavailable to the team. The expectation that teams are to engage in mission as broadly as churches, local churches, is a gross misunderstanding of the primary activities of the apostolic. I think we find ourselves in a time whereby these two elements of the body of Christ are muddied in our thinking. I see church planting teams that are sent out all the time with the expectation of basically functioning as a local established church. Oftentimes being sent out with a great deal of complexity and organization and basically saying, here's how you've got to go out and do it. And you begin to say, well, what are they doing? And it looks just like the mother church that's been in existence for 50, 60, 100 years. Two different components, two different types of ministry, two different significant aspects of what it means to live out mission locally, to live out mission in an area whereby there's no foundation that has come into existence. Broad is the way of the church, but narrow is the way of the apostolic teams. When the church speaks of mission, it is necessary to distinguish between the two. Herein lies a great failure in contemporary conversations. Little distinction is often made between the local church and the apostolic team. Many of the functions frequently described by writers today are to be applied to the local church's ministry and fail to recognize the narrow set of parameters out of which apostolic teams primarily operate. I would say when you look at an apostolic team, when you look at a church planting team, what exists in that team in microcosm is to manifest itself on a grand scale once a local church comes into existence. That those teams carry with them a gospel DNA of what it means to live life in covenant community with one another and to carry out this kingdom ethic in relation to one another and outsiders and to God. But what exists there on a microscopic level, once the church is planted, is to grow and develop on a major scale as the Spirit and the Word work and sanctify this local expression of Christ's universal body. But we often don't think in those terms. We often get the cart before the horse, expecting things for these teams to be engaging in at a time in history when that's really not appropriate. And when you look at it scripturally, it's hard to answer that question. So where do we find ourselves? And I would say the issue is that we find ourselves at a crossroads, and I would challenge agencies and churches to begin to think about, well, what are the primary apostolic functions of this concept that comes out of this apostolic imagination? And I would say what you see are at least 6 things that these teams were doing as they went into the world. They were preaching to unbelievers, they were teaching new disciples, they were planting churches, they were developing elders, they were caring for new churches, they were partnering with new churches. But it was happening on a much smaller scale than a church that had been in existence for several decades and had experienced a great deal of sanctification. So let me take us to the issue of location. And then I'll throw it open for some questions. So, reimagining location. We know that what is the task at hand is more than just crossing oceans, that we're about crossing gaps, cultural gaps, moving from Jerusalem into the mindset of the Samaritans, moving from Jerusalem or moving from the town of Joppa into the worldview of the God-fearers in Cornelius' home, moving from Jerusalem up into Antioch, 300 miles north, into a Gentile Hellenistic mindset. It's about crossing cultural gaps. It's not so much about crossing geographical boundaries, if you will. And so what we find ourselves in at this point in time is really, I think, a crossroads. And that is, where is the location of what this stuff that we're supposed to be doing in light of the global task at hand? How should the church think in terms of apostolic type work? And I would say this is a great passage to meditate on. It's not the only one, but it's one to think about, because what you see here that I believe is very much about the heartbeat of a lot of the apostolic work that we saw in the first century in the book in the New Testament is this notion of the teams desiring to take the gospel into places where a foundation has not been established. And the question is, where did Paul in Romans 15 get that aspect of his apostolic mindset, his apostolic imagination? And he got it where he gets a lot of his mission theology. The Old Testament. Isaiah. Read the passage. He quotes Isaiah. What does Isaiah say? Isaiah is talking about going to places whereby the good news has not been received. And Paul is saying, hey, I have preached from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum. There's no other place for me to preach. My desire is to preach where a foundation has not been laid. Now, I don't think that the Apostle Paul had in mind this contemporary construct that we have today that we call unreached people groups or unengaged people groups. But I do know he's talking about preaching to a group of people in a context where there is no foundation on which to bring the gospel and to see the church come into existence. So what is our present reality? The present reality is that there are 4.5 billion people in the world that are less than 2% evangelical, which means there are many of those people, there is no foundation existing among them, and in many of them, there's a very, very, very small foundation. Among that 4.5 billion people, we have frontier people groups. 25% of the world's population, not talking about evangelicals now, 25% of the world's population, less than 0.1% Christian. Do you think that there are many places in the world among many groups of people where there is no foundation? Set aside whether or not Paul had the contemporary construct in mind of unreached people groups, but the issue of foundation. And I would say yes. And so I would begin to ask, where's our priority? Where's our attention? Where are we going? And right now, for every 30 people that we send out under the umbrella of the title missionary, they go to work among reached people. For every 30, we send out one to go to the unreached and the frontier people groups. And I would just ask the question, what would the apostolic imagination say to that reality that we presently find ourselves in at this point in the 21st century. So let me pause here because we got 5, 10, 15, 10, 15 minutes left. And see if you have questions or things that you would like to raise or I don't know, things you want to throw at me or something. And if I don't know the answer, I'll turn it over to Dr. Parks here and let him answer it. So, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to ask? What do you want to push back on? I'd love to hear from you and get your thoughts on it. Now that you all have been able to eat and swallow. So how would I speak to like a place like New York City, which is post-Christianized, but you have all these nations that are there. So I do talk about that in the book. I didn't get into the chapter on the West just for our sake of time. I'm glad you brought this up. So last time I saw, Global Gates out of New York said that there are 800 languages spoken in the public school system in the metro New York area. And they've done a lot of their research. Look at the number of unreached people groups and the populations of those groups that reside in that city. So I would say the opportunities for apostolic engagement, apostolic type work is huge in a place like that. But what we often do is we approach it through a set of pastoral lenses. And again, keep in mind, a pastor teacher is talking to you. So we often approach it. Why? Because within this context, we have historically been, come to the understanding this is a Christianized context. Now, we can go back to looking at what that meant in Europe and how it's brought over here, but we've often thought about it as that. And in light of that, we have churches all over the place, and so our approach to engagement is not so much about crossing cultural gaps. It's about going down the street and taking pastoral methodologies to lead people to reach people with the gospel, which works in many cases. But there are some cultural gaps, even in New York, that are so great between the one who is preaching the gospel and the hearer that it's going to require more of an apostolic approach. It's a great question. Top 3 countries in the world for unreached people groups. Number 1 is India, largest number in India. Number 2 is China. Largest number of unreached people groups in the world are in China. Who's number 3? See, that's the chapter that no one ever gets to in Sunday school class. That's the chapter of the book that no one wants to talk about. The United States is the 3rd largest country in the world when it comes to unreached people groups. And most of those that we have identified as unreached are unengaged, meaning that there is no evangelical church planting strategy among any denominational or non-denominational stripe seeking to engage them in the United States. It's a complex answer. And there are a lot of people making all those decisions because we're talking about thousands of agencies just in, for example, the United States alone that have their headquarters here. But there's a whole history here. There's a whole missiology here behind this notion of, well, what are we doing? And it comes back to how have we defined missions? And so there are a lot of things that the church should do and should be involved in and should be putting resources toward that I would say are not the apostolic work that she should be doing and putting resources toward. It doesn't mean that she neglects one in favor of the other. It just means that we need to stop and think about some of these things. And so we're now in a very thick culture, as I mentioned just a moment ago, whereby you can be working among an unreached people group that's never heard the gospel in Central Asia, and you can be working among a reached people group that 92% Christianized, with a very high evangelical percentage, and we basically say, well, it's all missions. It's all the same. It should be all the same. And so that's just where we are. And so I realize what I'm calling for is very much a paradigm shift, and it will not happen overnight. And we live in a very, very thick tradition that's supporting why it's a 30-1 in the U.S. So it's a great question. Yes, sir. Certainly. And if I'm off track, then throw something at me and tell me that no, you're not getting where I was wanting you to go. So first of all, I'm not opposed to using the traditional language of mission, missions, and missionary. But here's the thing. If you use the traditional language, you're going to have to tightly define it. You're going to have to tightly define it in-house with your church or with your agency, organization, or whatever. But then as soon as you step out of that insider group and you hang out with other brothers and sisters in the Lord, you're going to have to be repeating your definitions over and over and over again. So, and there's some churches and some groups that are not even, they're getting rid of it. They're moving to a different set of nomenclature. But That's not your question, but I want you to understand that because it needs to precede my response. I don't believe that everyone is that apostolic type of individual. I believe that every Christian is to be a witness. Every Christian is to be sharing his or her faith. Every Christian is to be involved in disciple making. But not all are called to be in that particular type of responsibility, role, and function. And so I would not, personally, I would not use the language every Christian is a missionary, even if I was holding to the language, the traditional language, because I would specifically define missionary in a very tight way as opposed to a broad way. So that would be my response. Like, for example, one Sunday morning I got up and I saw a social media post. Someone had posted, I don't even remember who posted this, and she said, this Sunday morning when you go to your worship gathering, look around in the room, and if you see someone sitting by themselves, go over to them and talk to them, because today we are all missionaries. And, of course, like, not me, but like, everybody's like, retreat. And so, what's the definition there? What's your definition of missionary? What's your definition of missions? What is it, So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's the way that I would come about it. That's the way I would respond to it. Paul and others, and I would say that's a big part. Part of it is, it's there are multiple levels here as far as the why, and so I don't want to put everybody in the same category and just say here's the one reason, here's the two reasons. It's a very, very, very complex issue. But I'd say part of it is one, a poor missiology based off of a poor theology. So it ultimately comes back to our theology and Bible. And for you Old Testament scholars, Old Testament is huge in theology of mission. Huge. Very important. So I think it comes back to that. The other thing I think comes to is an issue of ignorance. There's just not an understanding of global realities. How many people in here gasped when I just said, what country is number 3? And I said the U.S. We don't know that story. This story's not being told. And the other issue, and there's so many, the other issue is I just don't know how. So maybe I've got an idea. If someone comes to me and says, hey, JD, you're pastoring my church, and I feel that the Lord is calling me to work among a Moroccan group in North Africa. What do I do? I'm going to get online. I'm going to find an agency. Get you to that agency. No, JD, you misunderstood what I said. I don't want to go to North Africa. I want to work among a Moroccan people group from North Africa that's living in New York or Birmingham, Alabama. And it's like, what do I do now? See what I'm saying? Missions do not it doesn't happen here because it's overseas. But migration, the globalization, all these things, they're bringing together a very unique moment that again, it just didn't happen overnight. It just didn't happen overnight. Back in 1991, David Bosch, mission theologian, wrote a book called Transforming Mission, a very, very influential work. I have a lot of reservations with some of the things he says in that book, but he was basically talking about a paradigm shift needs to take place. And I would say, he publishes that in 91, and we haven't transitioned into the paradigm shift. We're still, for you anthropologists in here, we're still in a liminal state. We're still in a transition state. I saw a hand right here. Yes, ma'am.
So in regards to...
For me, it all comes back to the local church, because I believe the teams are to be raised up from within and sent out from local churches. And so it comes back to the local church. It comes back to your pastoral leadership, your teachers and others communicating not only a biblical theology, biblical missiology, but a global perspective of the realities abroad and in our backyard. And so at that point in time, the church begins to say, Holy Spirit, who are you calling out? Lord, raise up people. Let's send them out. And then commissioning, sending, things of that nature. And I recognize this is going to work differently in different denominations and different non-denominational groups and networks and things of that nature. And different groups have different ecclesiologies behind that. I totally get that. But how does this fit into your denominational structure or non-denominational structure? We've got to figure out a way of how to make it fit. So if it's across the street, I would say, yes, engage people as much as you can with just direct, evangelism. But oftentimes, you have to really shift gears into something that takes us into a type of evangelism that is more intercultural, that's crossing larger cultural gaps. And the pastoral approach to doing so and training people how to do that type of evangelism, for the most part, doesn't really exist. But we're training other people to do it in other parts of the world. Yes, sir?
I'm double dipping
You are double dipping. That's okay. We got just a few minutes left, and I have to pitch it back to Dr. Parks. Oh, absolutely. I'm watching everybody squirm right now. Everybody's been squirming for the past hour, and I'm just sitting up here enjoying it, and no one's had the guts to call me out on it. But you did, brother. You did. Buy my book. You can pre-order it now. It's a great Valentine's Day present. So let me give you my take on that before he pulls out the shepherd's hook and pulls me off stage. So here's my take. I'm not alone in this, but I recognize there are a lot of people that do not agree with me on this. In the New Testament, I believe when it comes to who is an apostle, here's what you see. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, Jesus is considered apostle. We're not Jesus. All right, there's the 12. We're not the 12. There's Paul. We're not Paul. There's possibly identified as apostle James, the brother of Jesus. We're not him. So all of that is set aside. We're not in that role, in that category. However, I do believe that there is a category that I will call the other category. And it's not receiving revelation from God. It's not bringing extra biblical teaching, extra biblical revelation, type of an apostolic authority, like we see with Paul and others. But you see things such as Acts chapter 14, verse 4, and verse 14, where not only Paul, but Barnabas in the same passage is identified with the word apostolos. We see passages like Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, where it seems that he's equating some of his team members as apostles. We see passages such as Philippians chapter 2, verse 25, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 23, whereby there are individuals that we translate them as they are messengers of the churches, but the word is apostolos. That's where we get it. Then, of course, we get into the whole issue of the super apostles, and then 50 years after Paul writes to the Corinthian church, you have these false apostles that need to be put under the test in Revelation chapter 2, verse 2, and it's like, well, if the list is only about 14 people long, why don't you send it around? If somebody shows up and says that I'm an apostle, to axe them out. Why do you have to test them? I do think that there was another category that's out there, but it wasn't like Jesus, Paul, James, the 12. It was more of those that were dealing with evangelism, disciple-making, being messengers of churches, planting churches, caring for churches, raising up leaders. So, thank you, brother, so much for letting me be here today.
Thank you.